For the next session, I think we've been asking Divya and Sridhar to speak for some time, and they've always said no. But it's so nice that they are finally coming forward, and we would like to invite Divya and Sridhar not just to share about NCF's work across different landscapes, about the work that they've been doing in restoration that NCF has been doing for the past many years. And I don't, so I'm going to invite Divya and Sridhar right now to come on stage and to share with us about themselves and the work that they will be taking for, and their work. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone, and wonderful to be here. And thank you so much to the organizers, to Cotton University, and to all of you.
Good morning, everyone. Looking forward to spending the next couple of days with you and getting to know all of your work better.
So we are going to do what we call our Laurel and Hardy routine. So both of us will be talking, or to decolonize it, Bunty or Bubbly routine. So I'll start first, and like I said, very happy to be here with all of you in Guwahati. But like Arjun was just saying, we were a little reluctant about giving this talk, and I was trying to, while coming here, I was thinking about this as, how is it that two of us who are, we started our careers as animal ecologists, what are we doing here at a conference talking about ecological restoration? And it, reminded me of a story. The story goes something like this. There's a bunch of people, like, the people in this room, who were traveling by train. And they were going by train, and in the AC chair car, it was fully packed, and the train was chugging along on the tracks. And then everything was fine until suddenly one of the passengers started screaming and shouting, clutching his stomach and chest, and like in immense pain. And so the passengers next to him tried to, help, and somehow it didn't work. So one of them turned around and shouted, saying, "Is there a doctor in the coach?" And someone from the back of the coach, put up their hand. And so they said, please come, So he walks up to this person who's in pain and, sits with him, does something, chats, whatever. And within a couple of minutes, the person absolutely, quietens down and, starts even dozing and is fine. And the doctor then gets up and starts walking back. And one passenger is very curious and says, "Doctor, what did you do? Did you give some medicine or treatment? What happened?" He said, "No, I just spoke to him and I said, 'This too shall pass.'" And he said, "That's all? You just spoke to him?" He said, "Yeah, I'm a doctor of philosophy." So what are we, two doctors of philosophy here, card-carrying doctors of philosophy, doing here on talking about restoration? So a little bit of background about how we got into this and how we got interested in restoration. I have to point this somewhere. This is not working. Next slide. Sorry about that.
This too shall pass.
This too shall pass, yeah. So my, just to get started, my own interest, the next slide please, yeah. My own interest in ecological restoration and the revival and recovery of ecosystems actually began nearly 30 years ago in Northeast India, in Mizoram, where I came as a student to study the effects of what is called zoom or shifting agriculture on birds. And you can see here that in 1994, and 95, I saw farmers chopping down bamboo and secondary forests, preparing the land for cultivation, and a few months later, the entire dried vegetation was set alight to prepare the soil for cultivation. And I was standing on the other side of the slope looking at this fire, and I thought my shirt will catch fire. It was so intense, the sounds of bamboo exploding and the ashes flying for kilometers in the sky and so on. And at that time, a lot of people, and even I, to an extent, believed that this is actually an act of destruction. This is an example of how forests are destroyed for human uses. But later, through my study, I came to understand that actually Zoom allows and creates a system by which the forest recovers naturally and actually very, very rapidly. Within a span of a few years, the forest springs back to life. And this I could again come to understand a little better when a few years later, about nearly 20 years later, I could go back to the same place in Dampa. In the next slide, please. Yeah, and you can play this. So this is 2014, you can see, it's a series of photos taken every year in March, April by myself and a colleague there called Zakuma. And you can see how this in 2 years, in 3 years, in 4 years, how the landscape changes and how very rapidly the bamboo and the forests spring back to life. So in that sense, I began to understand that the farmers had actually learned to capitalize on the natural powers of recovery and regeneration that is there in nature. And this, I think, is a core concept in restoration as well. How do we leverage this power of regeneration and recovery in applying ecological restoration? That was, in a sense, how I got interested in this. Divya's story is a little more directly brought us to ecological restoration. As her research, which was on mammals as well as birds like hornbills, she says hornbills are also honorary mammals, so mostly mammals. And she studied this really rare endemic nocturnal civet called the brown palm civet in the forests of the Western Ghats. And although it's a carnivore, most of its diet was fruits. So they used to eat a lot of fruits, and in the forest you would see scats being deposited on the ground. And her research was trying to look at how do civets, what kind of role do they play in forest regeneration. As part of that, she started growing plants from seeds taken from scats, seeds collected from the tree, doing germination experiments and so on. And you can see our first nursery there. This is in 97 or 98. It's a dilapidated shed behind our base camp in Kalakadmandandurai Tiger Reserve, where we started growing these rainforest plants, which actually until that time we had no clue could actually be raised from seeds. So at the end of the study, we were able to raise so many different species of native rainforest trees that we earlier didn't know could be raised so easily from seeds. And what do you do with that when your experiment is over? You can't just throw the seedlings aside. So we looked for places that were degraded, near our base camp, abandoned cardamom plantations, and went and planted these seedlings out. And that really was the, if you pardon the pun, the seed of origin of our restoration program. And next slide, please. So today's talk, what we will do is I will try and introduce the context of tropical forests and restoration in the present day context. And after that, Divya will come and share the experiences, our experiences in trying to restore tropical forests in different parts of India. Then I'll try and come back to you with what does this mean in the wider sense? What are the implications of what we've learned for policy and for practice in the Indian context? I think, as all of you would know, tropical forests are among the most remarkable and diverse ecosystems we have. Maybe close to half the biodiversity on the planet is in these kinds of forests, particularly in what we call the evergreen forests or the rainforests. So the biodiversity wealth is immense, as we all know. And India is one of the few countries, maybe just one of 2 countries globally, that has 4 biodiversity hotspots within its boundaries. So we have the Himalaya, we have Western Ghats, we have the Indo-Burma, and Sundaland, which is in. All these 4 biodiversity hotspots are actually significant because they also hold tropical rainforests. And globally, research has shown the importance of these forests for climate and hydrology. They not only produce a lot of moisture and influence the climate locally, but also downwind. There are areas, hundreds of kilometers downwind of these ecosystems that benefit from tropical forests, and we are just beginning to understand these larger scale processes. And in the current context of climate change, and there has been a lot of focus on tropical forests as a carbon sink. They hold enormous amounts of carbon in the biomass and in the vegetation. If we lose those forests, all that carbon is going to go up into the atmosphere and actually accentuate and make climate change even worse. But there is also a belief that they can play an important role in storing carbon, and I'll come to that a little later. Finally, there are immense cultural values, the resources that these forests provide to human beings. Almost all the tropical forests in the world have human communities living among them, and I think that's a value that we should not forget as well. So, what is happening to tropical forests today? Actually, it is quite serious. We continue to lose tropical forests at a very alarming rate, somewhere between 3 million and up to 9 million hectares. Just to put that in perspective, in the last few years, each year, an area that is maybe at least half the size of Assam to even larger than the state of Arunachal Pradesh of tropical forest is being lost every year. And what that does is that not only is there direct loss of tropical forests, there's a lot of other fragmentation and degradation that is ongoing. So people have estimated that less than 1/4 of the tropical forest that remains is what we can call as intact. And remember that already, historically, we've lost 50% of the tropical forests that were there around the world. So we now have 1/4 of the half that used to exist, which is in an intact state. A lot of it is in degraded and damaged states. And the trajectory, at least as of present, doesn't show any signs of leveling off or decreasing. So why is this happening? I think this also should be familiar to everyone. There's a whole litany of threats to tropical forests, ranging from industrial scale logging, other expansions of industry and hydroelectric projects. There are agriculture and monoculture plantations, soy and oil palm and a whole range of other crops, which often not only leads to loss of forests, but leaves these remnants or fragments in landscapes which are surrounded by other kinds of land uses, what we call habitat fragmentation, which comes with its own edge effects, which comes with other problems such as invasion of weeds and invasive alien plants into these ecosystems, affecting their status even further, and wildfires and extreme weather events which are increasing due to climate change. So a whole set of factors are influencing what's happening in tropical forests today. And the response to this has often been from conservationists and scientists. Sometimes it's almost of despair. So for instance, E.O. Wilson writes in The Future of Life, "Such is likely to be the world of 2100 if present trends continue. The most memorable heritage of the 21st century will be the age of loneliness that lies before humanity," what he calls the Eremocene. And others, of course, have pointed to this as the Anthropocene, as a very human-dominated age that is likely to leave only strips and bits of forest left in the near future. But what is also true is that, like I said a little earlier, nearly 76% of tropical forests still exist, and they exist in degraded and secondary stages, or whatever we call secondary forests. These are not blank areas with nothing. They often have a lot of value for conservation, and research is showing that these forests, many species persist in these forests, like my own research showed in the shifting cultivation landscape in Mizoram. The Jum landscape actually sustained a much larger diversity of birds than a monoculture plantation such as oil palm or other kinds of land uses. So this habitat, as a habitat for many species, these forests hold a lot of value. Second is that they are already on the path of recovery. So they hold a high potential for recovery and restoration. And And during that process, they are accumulating biomass. They are also pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in their biomass. So there is a lot of value in terms of carbon sequestration, which is, may have implications for climate. So there is a future carbon sink of nearly 53 teragrams, per year is the sort of estimate of what secondary forests are today. And as a result of this, there have been many approaches to try and ecologically restore tropical forests. And this ranges from approaches that are international to national to even state level or even local efforts. And as you all know, we are right in the middle of the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, which has spurred a lot of thinking and action about restoration globally. Within India, we have a commitment under the Bond Challenge, a fairly, enthusiastic sort of commitment to restore 26 million hectares, primarily of forests, within the country in the span of the next few years. Concurrently, both at the national level and state level, there are many missions, green missions that have been started to try and increase forest cover, primarily through tree planting approaches across the country. A couple of states in India, that is Tamil Nadu and Kerala, have also come up with policies on ecological restoration and on trying to avoid the use of invasive alien species going forward. So there's a range of policy responses globally and even regionally and locally that are coming out in relation to this. So what does that mean? What does it mean when we say we want to restore tropical rainforest, and that to ecologically restore tropical rainforest? So the usual definition we use for ecological restoration is what the Society for Ecological Restoration, SER International, uses, which is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. Now let's take this apart a little bit. Remember that ecological restoration is not an approach that tries to reinstate something completely piece by piece. If you compare it with, say, architectural restoration or, say, restoring a painting, where if you can get the right pigments and if you have the, sort of the model, you can sort of put everything back and it looks almost like the original. In restoration, the nature is also changing at the same time. Imagine you're trying to restore a painting and the paint comes back to life while you're doing it. It's something like that. So what we are trying to do is actually assisting that process of recovery. We are not trying to put everything back. We probably can't do it ourselves. So we are trying to assist that process by which nature can recover on its own and use that power of regeneration that it intrinsically has. So, and there's a whole range of approaches. You would have heard of terms like reclamation, rehabilitation, regreening, and so on and so forth. I'll come back to it a little bit later. But how does restoration sort of differ from all of these approaches? The key aspect really is where restoration begins, where we focus on initiating native recovery, understanding what the native ecosystems are, native species are, and trying to stimulate the recovery of those. That creates a whole spectrum of approaches that we can sort of call ecological restoration. And key to doing that ecological restoration are a number of different things. I'll touch upon four aspects related to ecology that should be a consideration in most restoration projects. Very first one is to try and identify the cause for degradation. Unless we understand what led to the degradation or what impacts that the degradation has had, we may never be able to properly address it or reverse it. So understanding the causes of degradation is like the first step. Second is, since we are attempting native recovery, we need to know what is the original ecosystem or the native ecosystem that we are trying to restore to. Was it a grassland? Was it a rainforest? Was it some other kind of forest? Was it a desert? And identifying that is what we call identifying the reference ecosystem or benchmark. And with that, we can move on to trying to implement restoration. And implementing restoration may have a different set of options. What kind of intervention we choose, what we choose to do, leads us to kinds of restoration that we. And finally, how do we monitor and assess recovery? Once we implement the restoration, is it actually working in the way that we want it to work? What is the trajectory of recovery? So these are 4 key aspects, and I'll just dwell on them in a little bit more. Next slide, please. Is that identifying degradation can take various forms. It could even be apparent to you on, here is an example where there's these are just satellite images of from parts of our study area in the Anamalais. You can see intact rainforests inside the Anamalais Tiger Reserve, and a degraded area at the fringe of the reserve where many of the large trees are gone because they had been logged in the past. All that white stuff that you see there are invasive species that have sort of spread into the forest. You have another site which has been damaged by road construction, soil erosion, so even the physical fabric of the slopes and the soil has changed. And finally, you have an area totally deforested, inundated by reservoir, where almost everything is gone. So these are different stages, and what we try and do there and will depend on how we understand the degradation here. Identifying the benchmark ecosystem or reference ecosystem can be easy or difficult depending on the location, and Divya will talk about it better. What I want to point out here is that what these are sites as they were prior to human disturbance, not prior to human presence, because people have probably been part of these ecosystems forever, for all practical purposes. So prior to the disturbance that led to the degradation, what was the site conditions? How do we find these sites? Sometimes we are lucky, they're close by. There are intact sites that are relatively undisturbed. Sometimes we have to look at historical information or maps, or there might be materials in books and floras that describe this. So trying to get at that is a crucial part of a restoration journey. And once we do that, there may be a range of interventions to choose from. Restoration does not mean immediately going and planting some trees or doing some intervention. There are sites which may recover on their own without much assistance from us if we are able to just stave off the forces of degradation. There are other sites which may need some level of protection, and there are sites where much more interventionist approaches such as removal of invasives and planting are required. So identifying which is the appropriate intervention is another crucial aspect. And finally is tracking the recovery. Having done whatever you have gone ahead to do, how do you judge whether your restoration has worked? And recovery itself is a concept which could be studied in different ways, and I think there is also a workshop about it today. But we could look at how the form or the structure of the ecosystem recovers. For instance, if you're restoring a forest, is the number of trees coming back, is the canopy cover increasing, etc. If it's a grassland, we may be looking at the grass cover as an index of recovery of form. It could be of diversity, which is very important, because in restoration, typically we are trying to bring back a wide diversity of species that are characteristic of that ecosystem. Also functions, like the carbon sequestration, nutrient cycling, are these functions returning to the restored sites? And finally of relationships. It could be between plants and animals, or the hornbills coming back to eat the fruits, or it could even be human-nature relationships as they were prior to the disturbance. So recovery really needs to look at all these dimensions to understand whether restoration is proceeding in the right direction. Now, in a sense, all of this is a little easier said than done. In practice, sometimes it can be difficult to apply. And I think now Divya will share with you our efforts at trying to apply restoration in different contexts. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks Sridhar for setting the context so beautifully, and I think what I'm going to share right now is our experience, our practical experience of how we got involved with this. So I would say it was some youthful energy 25 years ago, some basic ecological knowledge, some understanding of restoration principles which we thought earlier on itself that it is something that we might have to commit the rest of our lives to. Secondly, the confidence that we could grow some rainforest species. And finally, I think what was most important was the support and encouragement we got from our colleagues and friends at NCF to start on this journey. So our basic goal, of course, when we started off 25 years ago, was just to revive degraded rainforests and support biodiversity conservation. And, sorry, next. Can I use this? Yeah? Oh, it's not working, okay. Yeah, so NCF has 5 ongoing restoration projects in 2 of the biodiversity hotspots, which are the Western Ghats and the Himalayas. And it's mostly in the Eastern Himalaya. And of this, our program in the Anamalais is the oldest, which we started 25 years ago. It's in southern Western Ghats. You can see a red blob over there. And why are these areas important? It is because of their known high biodiversity, as well as the uniqueness of the ecosystems and the species that occur in these regions. So let me start off in detail about our Anamalai program. Sorry. Yeah. So we are in southern Western Ghats, which is a tropical rainforest region of the mid-elevation zone. But currently our landscape looks like that, like what you see on your right. It's a region mostly dominated by tea, coffee, and cardamom plantations, small patches of eucalyptus plantations, and even smaller patches of forest left embedded within this landscape. And this landscape is the Valparai Plateau, and we are surrounded by the Anamalai Tiger Reserve to the north, east, and on the west we have the relatively undisturbed reserve forest in Kerala. So when we started our work in the Anamalais, we were basically trying to understand what the value and importance of these patches of forest that are embedded within plantations are. So we carried out surveys for vegetation, different taxa of animals like birds, frogs and reptiles, etc. And then one thing we realized was that irrespective of the size of the fragment, some of these animals have managed to survive, even in very, very small patches of forest, as long as the condition of the forest was good, in the sense that they're structurally not so disturbed. So to give you an idea, this is a relatively undisturbed forest. You could have forest patches which are very, very degraded and completely open. Remember that there's a rainforest, so if there is no canopy cover, which means that it's really in a very high state of degradation. But you also have sites which are open and therefore clogged with mostly invasive species, and creating a arrested succession kind of a site condition. So we knew that then there is a lot of scope for restoration in sites like this. But what should these sites look like? And therefore we also spent a couple of years trying to understand the plant communities in this region and try to match the species that would be suitable to be used for restoration in the mid-elevation zone of the rainforest in the Anamalais, which ranges between 700 to about 1,400 meters. And while we were doing all these surveys and carrying out our research, we also understood better what are the combinations of the plants to be used, how would they fare under different levels of disturbance, etc. So the methods that we used are mainly 2 methods. I mean, actually, the first method was the maximum diversity method. We wanted to kind of jumpstart the process of restoration. So we wanted to raise as many species as possible and plant them out and then learn as they grow or as they didn't grow or as they didn't make it. But we also had the advantage of knowing which were the species that are dispersed by, say, hornbills or small mammals, and we therefore also try to raise as many of those species as possible, and that's what we call the framework species method, where once these plants grow, we hope that the dispersers would bring in more seeds and the forest would be functioning on their own. In more recent years, in order to scale up, we have started using this method of assisted natural regeneration, which is basically about freeing up naturally regenerating native species from weeds which are probably outcompeting them. But in order to carry out any successful restoration project, which we all know is inherently a long-term effort, one of the vital needs or infrastructure or core requirement is a very good nursery, a native plant nursery, which unfortunately we cannot depend on, say, the forest department or any other departments which may be functioning in the same landscape. And therefore, we started our own nurseries. Sorry, I keep forgetting to use this as I turn here. I think it's changing. Anyway, so we started our nursery in the Anamalais in 2000. We've grown more than 300 species of mostly trees, some lianas and shrubs, and these also include many species that are threatened or endemic. But what we've also kept in mind right from the beginning is that the seed and seedling collections have to be ethically and thoughtfully done, in the sense that we've always only collected our seeds and seedlings from along roads, borders between the plantations and the forest patches, and never from inside the forest itself. Because as is, these forests are quite disturbed. If you go around collecting and clean sweeping the seeds and seedlings from the forest, we might actually be affecting their natural recovery and regeneration. And also probably taking off a lot of resources from the other animals and other things that depend on these forests. And one of the other key philosophies of running our nursery also has been to make sure that we collect seeds from as many parent trees as possible, so that we do get a good genetic diversity of plants. Secondly, also that we grow plants from within the region of interest for restoration. We do not, even if they are threatened species, we are, as of now, still trying not to get seeds from other regions, because I think evolutionarily, ecologically, they have some uniqueness, which as restoration practitioners, maybe we should be assisting our forests with. One of the other things that we do follow when we are preparing our sites, just to give you a little more background, is like we are working on private lands. We are working on forest patches which are with private tea plantation companies. And most of these fragments could range anywhere between less than 1 hectare to about 100 hectares. And they are in different states of degradation. And when we go into a forest patch, we kind of assess the status and we identify sites within those patches which are the most degraded, and that's where we put most of our restoration efforts in. And when we are doing that, one of the main things for us is actually removal of invasive species. And these are the densest along the boundaries of the forest patches. But when we are carrying out de-weeding, we make sure that whatever is naturally regenerating is retained. And this, I think, has played a very, very vital role in the recovery of the sites that we have been working in. We definitely do not like doing this, where everything that is in the understory is cleared up, because that's easier to do, it's faster to do, and it's probably more cost effective. But we have seen that affects it further degrades the site that you're trying to restore, and it takes much longer to recover. But in some of the sites, I think it may be inevitable. It might be difficult to avoid doing this because of the other challenges we have in finding enough number of people. And most of you who have engaged with restoration know, apart from it being a longer term commitment, it is also very labor intensive. So you need a lot of people doing this work. Otherwise, as is, good quality restoration happens in very small patches, and it could become even more difficult going forward. So finally, in the Anamalais, during the monsoon, we carry out restoration planting. Many people come and volunteer with us, although we don't have a systematic way of taking in volunteers, but there are people who do come and join us for planting during this monsoon. Otherwise, it's about 20 to 30 of us who are all enjoying getting wet in the rain and planting up the sites. To give you an overall picture of what we have managed to achieve in 25 years, if you can call it an achievement, is to restore, actively restore, when I mean actively restore, actually actively plant up in only about 115 hectares across 19 different sites in the Anamalais. However, since these are again private plantation companies, we have partnered with them. We've identified about 35 forest fragments, which amount to about 1,000 hectares, and that also gets recognized as patches of biological importance and therefore need to be protected. We've planted only about 1 lakh of saplings in over 25 years, and like I mentioned before, our approach has been maximum diversity method with and a bit of framework species methods. So just to give you a sense of what our sites looked like when we started work and then what they look like now. This is one of the smallest restoration patches we have. So this was in 2005 and we cleared up the weeds, and then 20 years later you can see how it has grown. I mean, even the reference tree is much larger now, and those trees are actually about 60 centimeters to 80 centimeters in dia. So the form and structure that Sridhar was mentioning can be clearly seen. This is another of our sites, a very small patch within a larger forest fragment, which was completely denuded. I don't know for what reasons, probably 70 or 80 years ago. And we planted it very densely, thinking that since it is so open, we might lose a lot of plants. But surprisingly, we had about 95% survival, and it's a very, very dense patch of forest. And now it's a patch which has started to fruit and flower and attract many species. This is another end of the same site, again, very degraded area which we took up. And you can see, there are some pioneer species, Clerodendron. Some of you might be familiar with that. And when we start, sometimes, not always, not as much as we should, we also involve local people and school children, and also the partners. These were the good old days when we started. I think there was much more, people had a lot more time, people were more connected than we are able to do in recent times. But anyway, this is one of the sites, and now again the site is like this, which is very, I mean, to kind of see it like this, where it has recovered, and you see animals like the hornbills and the Nilgiri langur or lion-tailed macaques use these forest patches, is what inspires us to continue in this landscape. And like we keep saying, I think in some sense, we could call it a restored site, but we still think that it is a process of restoration because we've planted up trees and they have grown, but we also wanted to know how much has it really grown. We wanted to quantify it. So in 2017, we picked up sites which were restored for anywhere between 10 to 15 years. And we compared restored sites with unrestored sites and our benchmark sites. Like, this is typically how it is. It's actually just across a valley. You know, what the reference ecosystem is within Anamalais Tiger Reserve. So, like I said, this is not like pristine ecosystem. It is an ecosystem which is in fairly better shape, fairly complete communities of plants and animals compared to these forest fragments which are within private estates. And what do we see? So as expected, or as we were hoping for, the restored sites are clearly doing better in certain parameters, like tree densities, canopy cover, species richness, carbon storage, than unrestored sites. So this kind of gave us the confidence that we are moving in the right direction. The forest patches are actually recovering. It's not just in form and structure, but probably also in their function. Similarly, if you take an indicator species or indicator group of species like the birds, we see that our restored sites have many more typical rainforest species of birds than the unrestored sites, but much lower than the benchmark sites still. So we are still on the path of recovery and we have really not completely recovered. And we took the rainforest species alone because they would actually indicate whether it is becoming a true rainforest or whether it is still a degraded patch. So while that was all very exciting to see that our restored sites are doing much better naturally than unrestored sites, it was also very humbling to learn and realize, which we knew, I suppose, at the back of our heads, is that even after 25 years or 15 to 25 years, you know, you're way behind what a natural ecosystem or a natural rainforest ecosystem would be like and should be like, particularly in terms of tree diversity, in terms of natural regeneration, and even carbon storage, right? Canopy cover is something that, you know, that you would expect to kind of recover faster because as long as these plants grow. The other thing is also that these sites, what is the future of these sites? These sites are still being used, and you know, most of our trees, when they grow to that size, you know, what we call poles or slightly larger timber size, they are being cut. We do not police as much, I think, or we don't want to, I don't know. But we also have incidences of fire, we have incidences of road expansions, which, you know, further push back these forests, whether they're recovering or sometimes even the benchmark sites. So a lot of other disturbances continue in this landscape. There are new things that are coming up, new invasive species that are coming up, and which we still have not figured out how to deal with. So that's where the humbling part of it comes, and we don't know, you know, how much longer we will need to work to have a fully recovered ecosystem or a patch of forest. And therefore, I think whether you are able to restore or not, or I do not think we can afford to lose whatever natural ecosystems we have, and they need to be protected first. You cannot cut down a patch of forest with the promise of restoring it either in the same region or elsewhere, and definitely not elsewhere. I mean, this compensatory afforestation is something that is just, you know, I mean, it's a scam. I'm sorry, I couldn't find a better word. So, yeah, so I also just wanted to introduce the other restoration projects that my colleagues at NCF are doing, and I'm not going to give great detail about it. They are here, Anand, Rohit, Aparajita is not here, but her team is here. And so they are the people you have to get all the details from. However, I'd like to introduce these other projects that we are doing. One is in the Nilgiris, another one is in central Western Ghats, northern Western Ghats, and in Arunachal Pradesh in Pakke. So I'm going to give you a very, very brief description of what the landscape looks like, what is that vegetation type, what is the benchmark that these projects have identified, and what is the ecoregion that it falls within. And I would really request all of you to also participate in the workshop on ecoregions that's happening, because ecoregions are very, very broad, what do you say, categorization or classification of the landscape, but clearly it does not capture all the finer level understanding of the plant communities that are dependent on various abiotic and biotic factors. So in the Nilgiri landscape, it's a fairly recent restoration project which we started last year in partnership with a plantation company in the Nilgiris, also with Keystone as sounding board, advisors, and collaborators. It's a landscape which spans from about 900 meters of moist deciduous forest to about 1,700 meters, which is shola forests. And we're still trying to figure out where that band of mid-elevation wet evergreen forest will fall, which is what we are most familiar with. And so the extremes of this landscape we are working in are completely new to us, and it is a big learning process. In the Malenadu landscape in central Western Ghats, we work in 2 districts, Has and Sakleshpur districts. Fortunately, it is a tropical wet evergreen mid-elevation forest. Again here the ecoregion is a very, very broad northwestern Ghats, moist deciduous, or northwestern Ghats tropical evergreen forest or mountain rainforest. And the benchmark, fortunately, again, we have some very good reserve forests close by which we are trying to use as benchmarks. But then there are challenges about this which I will come to shortly. The restoration work in Sahyadri is led by Rohit, is also started more recently in 2023. Again, mostly on private land, but smaller landholders, different kinds of land use. It's been like he's carried out lots of vegetation work here, and it seems like a moist deciduous or dry deciduous belt. However, if you look at the amount of rainfall that area receives, it should be a rainforest. And the benchmark sites, he's currently identified some of the sacred groves, but then again, they're all in different state of degradation or protection. Areas are small, they're in very, very specific altitude range, so it is quite a challenge, and you should talk to him more about it. And the restoration work in Pakke is a bit longer, what we call middle-aged. So it's started in 2014, once again started with building of a nursery first, and then started planting it from 2016 onwards. Again, it is a semi-evergreen forest type, but if you go by the ecoregions, it really does not match very well with what people from the field know of the region. So it has become a, like, what exactly should we be calling it? We do not know. But fortunately, again, there is a protected area. So it's not that these protected areas are pristine or whatever. They have been logged before. There's been lots of different kinds of degradation factors. There's been fire, etc. But then compared to areas which are either logged or completely converted to something else, those still become our benchmark sites. And because again it is a much longer project, and the project began, although the restoration project began only in 2014, Aparajita has been working in that landscape for about 15 years before that, and there's been a lot of ecological research that has helped us understand how to go about restoration here, and this also includes kind of providing culturally important species to the community forest around Pakke Tiger Reserve. I thought if Aparajita is here, she would have wanted to see this. She loves putting pictures or images of fruits and seeds. Just to show you, this is one thing that we are really proud of. All our nurseries are doing very well. We've learned so much from them. And we have four NCF nurseries, NCF managed nurseries, but Rohit and Anand in the central and northern western Ghats also have managed to partner with local landholders to develop nurseries, and they help them with it. These are our small teams from our different sites. There's Anamalais, Pakke, central western Ghats, Nilgiris, and northern western Ghats. Again, not all the members are present in these pictures because I don't know, none of us have managed, I think, to get everyone together to take a photo. People have been very busy doing their work. And this is to summarize what our various efforts have been in terms of the number of seeds, plants raised, seeds collected per year, saplings planted, not per year, there's a cumulative, how many saplings we've planted in the lifespan of our respective ecological restoration programs. We've managed to raise a lot of species together. I think across the Western Ghats and Pakke, we probably have raised more than, I don't know, maybe 600, 700 species of native plants suitable for those respective regions. However, if you look at the total amount of area planted, it's really, considering the areas of forest being lost, like Sridhar was mentioning, maybe half the size of Assam, maybe over the size of Arunachal. We're losing so much of forest, and this is about all we've managed to do. And therefore, should one be doing restoration at all? And realistically speaking, we are all able to plant with our small teams 3 to 6 hectares per year. And our small teams are ranged between 12 to 15 members. But this also is because restoration is not the only thing we do. We do a lot of research because of our interest in understanding ecological systems that we work in, and also to constantly assess and monitor whether our restoration efforts are working and whether it is even worth doing. Usually the feedback is positive, probably because we want to continue to do what we are doing right now. One of our main efforts, again, in all our sites is to train for outreach, to produce materials which can help other people start their own restoration programs, start their own efforts, and also probably produce materials like this which are suitable for their specific sites. So, when we started preparing for this talk, we spoke to our colleagues and said, okay, so what motivates us to continue doing what we are doing? And these are some of the responses we got. We've kind of combined them. It's seeing the change on the ground, even though they are small patches, really helps us continue to do what we're doing. And having been in this field for so long, we feel that it is not just about how large a patch is, but also what the quality of the patch itself is. And locally, any conservation success really matters. whether it's a 1 hectare patch that you manage to restore or 100 hectares, as long as it's functioning and it exists, it still matters. And of course, there is a lot of support and enthusiasm in our teams, which keeps us going. We have fortunately found very good partners who worked with us all these years, 20 years, 25 years, they have been partners with us. And it has largely been out of goodwill. It's not a business deal. It is not like, they're greenwashing or something. It was completely out of goodwill. Even these plantation companies who want to restore whatever patches they have back to forests under better condition, and actually help with conservation of wildlife as well. Yeah, we also enjoy the research aspects of it, and I think that also gives us a positive feedback. But like I keep telling Sridhar, that I'm always a bad cop, slightly more pessimistic than probably most other people. So I would like to end with some of the challenges that we continue to face. In all these years, it's not like we've figured out a solution to these challenges, but we know that these challenges exist, and I think even our younger colleagues are facing these challenges. It's something that we need to keep in mind, and we really would appreciate to get some feedback from you as to how to deal with this better. And ecologically speaking, identifying benchmark sites. So in many areas which has seen decades or centuries of degradation, you may not find a very good benchmark site. In which case, what is it that we can fall back on? Can we create these materials as ERA, as a group, and be able to help other people, and not everyone could be as lucky as we have been in the Anamalais, where we have a Anamalai Tiger Reserve or a Valachal Forest Reserve to fall back on. Ecoregions definitely need a finer level classification or division or descriptions, and which I think the knowledge desk is taking up, and I think if all of us can contribute to it, it will really, really help us going forward. Biphasic ecosystems, where we have very stark, like for example in central western Ghats, which is generally a tropical wet evergreen areas, but then there are large areas of grasslands like you can see in this picture. So we do not know whether they're originally grasslands, and is it something that we should be planting up. But if you go into those grasslands, you see some very unique grassland species of, say, orchids, some herbaceous plants, etc. So we really do not know what exactly to do here. I don't know, I think at some point we hope that we'll be able to figure it out. And similarly with shola grasslands, the grasslands in the Nilgiris have all been planted up, but it's not just the grasslands, but now sholas are coming back under some of these plantations. So should we leave them just like that, or should we be actually going after all invasive species, on a war footing? It's not something that we really have an answer for. It's a thing that we are dealing with at every site we go to. And benchmarks themselves, especially in the because of the climate scenario, I think are in a state of flux. Like even in the Anamalais, we are losing. In our lifetimes, in our times, there itself we have seen a lot of changes even within our, what we call the benchmark sites. The other one, another challenge is working with partners. Like I said, we have had partners who basically on board out of goodwill, but we are always wondering how long is it going to last, especially with the changing economic and industrial scene where tea is not doing very well. They're looking at alternate ways of earning some revenue, and then it becomes a carbon credit project, and then what happens to the need for restoration or to the support that they've given for restoration with good a good ecological restoration program. So another challenge are local communities. I think it's a challenge while the local communities have been stewards of the land they own, but I think in many areas there is uncertainty about the tenure. There's still there are bigger players and bigger challenges that local communities themselves face in order to figure out how to manage the land that they may want to restore. Forest department is also a challenge because the scale at which they work may not be really suitable for good ecological restoration outcomes. And when it becomes target-driven or scheme-driven, there is a rush to just plant whatever they get and wherever they can. And I think that's a big challenge we as a community face. Like I already mentioned, among the partners, it's about trying to see if they can use restoration efforts to get them some revenue. It may not be a bad thing in itself, but whether they will do it in the right spirit is something that worries us, and it's a challenge that we again have been facing in more recent times. And some of the partners are not easy to work with, but then they have land which are very, very important and which has huge potential for good ecological restoration and wildlife conservation. And it is a challenge that we need to take up whether we like it or not. Funding, of course, because like I already mentioned, ecological restoration is inherently a long-term and a very labor and fund-intensive program. And most often, no funders give you funds for more than a year or two. And then, especially when you're starting up, you don't know how much you want to invest and whether you can keep the project going. We have been lucky. It's not like we've had funds right through. There were years when we didn't have funds, but once you have some basic infrastructure, it can run. But I think for new projects, to know that they have a 5 or 6 years or even 10 years of commitment of funding can make a lot of difference for all the restoration projects that want to start. The second biggest problem, again, in more recent times is, although we believe that ecological restoration we are doing it to conserve biodiversity, but at the same time, I think both funders, sometimes even practitioners, even our fellow colleagues are asking us what is in it for people. So I don't know if we really have an answer for it, because again, it takes a very long time to recover any degraded ecosystem. We can say that they will have all these benefits, but I don't know. It's probably not tangible, and whether we can put a price on it is, I don't know philosophically whether we are okay with it. So it's also a big challenge that we keep thinking about and coming back to very often. CSR funding has been a game changer in some ways. So there's lots of funds available, but again, I think there is a slight mismatch in their targets and the way we work towards ecological restoration. Like Rita was mentioning in her opening talk, that we need to figure out what is the right way to ecologically restore a degraded system. And I think the CSR funding agencies are still not at the same level of understanding, and we need to try and change that. And another challenge, again, is scaling up. Like I showed you, over 25 years, across so many different restoration projects, we've managed to restore less than 200 hectares. And but we do know that it is quality restoration. But again, when funding agencies come to you, they want you to restore thousands or hundreds or, I don't know, hundreds of square kilometers of area. There is potential to do that, but then, I think there will be we need to balance between quality versus quantity, and I don't know which one we should be going for, or whether there is a middle ground to it. Then there are these other things. It depends on where you are, site accessibility, number of people that you need who can work with you. And that's one of the reasons I think ERA came into being, because we knew that people are working across the country in their own little patches, and we wanted to bring everybody together. And together, I think we can make a huge difference. And I think the scaling up can come through alliances like ERA. And I think there is a Northeast Restoration Collective, which has also been formed over the last 2-3 years. And I think these kind of collectives and alliances is what should be used to scale up good ecological restoration. And it's not just about the amount not about the area that's planted. I don't think that is what we should be measuring when it comes to effective restoration. And so this brings us back to policy. So policy changes, how to deal with policies is also probably another way to address most of these challenges that I just mentioned, and Sridhar will be talking to you about them.
Thanks, Divya, for that sharing. Like I earlier mentioned, the challenges of practicing ecological restoration, applying those concepts that we highlighted as important for restoration, and on reflecting on where we are. I think taking from this, let us step back a bit and look at what I mentioned at the beginning, which is on these global and national and state level and local efforts which are trying to restore and to regreen areas. And before I step into that, let's just take a moment to look at what are some of the characteristics and differences between what we call as restoration and what these other approaches are. And for the purposes of this discussion, we can use this, if ecological restoration is about assisting the recovery of ecosystems that are degraded, regreening is something a little more general, a little more generic, where we are trying to just increase forest cover or just increase tree cover, not really being specific to ecosystem or species in various kinds of areas, including intensively used human use areas and land use types. Another term that is often crops up in the literature, and they are often used interchangeably, but it's very important to understand the difference, is reforestation and afforestation. Strictly speaking, reforestation is bringing forests back to areas that had forests earlier, whereas afforestation is bringing forests into areas that were open, non-forest lands that probably never had tree cover earlier or had very limited tree cover earlier. And this is particularly significant in the Indian context. Another important thing to understand is, as Divya pointed out, when we look at restoration, we need to look at the trajectory of recovery. And what are the metrics that we use to judge whether something is working or not? So if you look very often at the metrics that are reported and that are targeted, like under the Bond Challenge, we have a target of 26 million hectares. We have area covered. The other thing is there are campaigns which say we have planted so many seedlings. Are these the right metrics? Have we actually restored such large hectarage? Have we actually, what has happened to those large number of seedlings after they have been put out in these sites? So if we really want to know whether something has worked or is aligned with the principles of ecological restoration, we need to change the metrics. We need to change the currency with which we are discussing and these aspects. And it could be a number of other metrics. It could be the number of native species that are used in that particular site. It could be looking at seedling survival and growth, or various parameters of recovery, including recovery of human uses that are commensurate with undisturbed or undegraded ecosystems, and recovery of wildlife. So there could be a range of different things. But unless we look at these different metrics, we may not be able to properly assess what is going on. So let us think about, given this backdrop of ecological restoration, what is not restoration and how it is panning out at least in the Indian context. So one very common approach that is being used and continues to be used is planting monocultures. That is, a single species of tree that is easy to grow and establishes very well, is often planted in large areas to quickly bring back some kind of greenery. And we know today that that leads to biodiversity loss, poorer carbon storage, and a number of other factors. Second aspect is that we often plant the wrong species. Over chai, we were discussing about how in parts of central India, people have planted subabul, the Leucaena leucocephala, which is a known invasive alien species, and there are many, many such examples. We've planted these species in these areas, we have brought them in, they are our guests, so to speak, but they have led to alien species invasions, biodiversity loss as well. A third aspect is that we set the wrong targets and, correspondingly the wrong metrics by which we assess those targets. And that often leads to destruction of ecosystems. So when you take a grassland area and you say, okay, I need to afforest this, and that's my target, and I plant trees in an area which never had trees before, we may have consequences of losing a unique ecosystem, impacts on the hydrology and so on. And finally, there are a range of quick fixes that are emerging today. Seed bombing using drones, people trying to drop crores of seed balls across hundreds of square kilometers, and a range of other things, including Miyawaki plantations everywhere and so on. Are these really aligned with the principles that we spoke about today, and are they having the desired results? So globally now, I think there's a vast body of literature which shows the real crucial importance of distinguishing natural forests from plantations. Even in areas that were forests or had tree cover earlier, we must make this distinction. This basic distinction is missing, even in our forest cover estimates. India's forest cover reports are not reporting natural forests and plantations separately. Everything is being lumped together. And we know this is very important because forests are much more biodiverse. They hold much more species. A single hectare of a rainforest like this may have 80 species of trees in 1 hectare, whereas a plantation like that basically has 1 species of tree, and correspondingly a range of other life forms. So biodiversity is hugely different. A lot of this is being driven by approaches to sequester more carbon. And it is true that even a plantation like that may capture carbon or may sequester carbon, but our research from southern and western Ghats shows that if you compare these monoculture plantations with corresponding natural forests of that region, they hold much more carbon stock, and that carbon stock also tends to be more stable over time, even through years of drought and other factors. So even from the carbon perspective, natural forests are better than plantations, but we are still doing more plantations. And a lot of this is being driven by the belief that ecological restoration is actually a solution, is a carbon solution, it's a nature-based solution to the climate crisis. That we can draw down this carbon from the atmosphere by planting trees or restoring ecosystems. And it's important to understand this. In some sense, there is a potential for this, like we showed in our own research, that if you compare restored forests with unrestored forests left to itself, we are able to actually increase the diversity and sequester more carbon in those sites. The question is, can this really address the climate crisis, which is a global problem? And earlier research did suggest this. There were suggestions of planting 1 trillion trees to somehow, draw down this carbon and address the climate crisis, etc. But more recent, more careful scientific research is questioning this. In fact, there is people like Susan Cook-Patten and others have suggested that we should really be focusing on protecting and managing existing areas and think of restoration only as a sort of a fallback or a third solution, and let's not compromise on these aspects. It's something that Divya also mentioned. Protecting the original ecosystems first is not something we should lose sight of. It's very, very important. The other studies which I've shown, this is a recent study from just a few months ago, which has done a fairly careful analysis of ecosystem restoration potential globally, considering that in grasslands or steppe ecosystems we will be restoring similar grasslands or steppes, in forests we'll be restoring forests, etc. And what that study shows is that even if all of this worked really well and you're able to implement it, we may be able to draw down only about about 17.6% of the carbon emitted till date. And if you extend it to include emissions that we are going to have in the near future, it's a small amount. It's 3.7 to 12% of the carbon can be drawn on if everything goes well and we are able to restore all the potential area that is available for restoration. And what this basically means is that we should be looking at ecosystem restoration as a carbon solution. It is not meant as something that can address climate change. There, the primary approach should be to bring down our dependence on fossil fuels and reach that energy transition as soon as possible. That is the big target. That's the more difficult target, but that's the target that really is required for as a climate solution. But what does restoration do? Just as we found in our own research and a range of other studies, restoration actually helps in many other ways. And we need to forefront those values better. The primary and most important aspect of ecological restoration is that it brings back biodiversity. Why don't we talk about that more? I think we should project ecological restoration in areas such as the 3/4 of tropical forests that are degraded as an immense opportunity to bring back biodiversity, not necessarily as a carbon solution for climate change, but it can contribute to bringing back biodiversity. There is good evidence for it, and there is good case studies from India and from around the world that shows that this does work. Similarly, it does, as Divya mentioned, it's a very labor intensive and it involves a lot of people. So there are livelihood opportunities associated with ecological restoration in some of our most remote areas. And therefore, ecological restoration has other values and it's worth pursuing primarily for those much more than as a carbon solution. In India, we are chasing certain targets, as I mentioned earlier. One common thing that all of you will be familiar with is the 33% forest cover. India needs to have 33% forest cover. Now, if you break this down by region, it doesn't make sense at all. Like, should Rajasthan have 33% forest cover, it will be a disaster for a different reason. If Arunachal had 33% forest cover, it's catastrophic, right? It should be much, much higher. So, this number, chasing this number at the national level, really doesn't make sense. It begins to make a little bit of sense when you look at it region-wise. And look at it historically as well. I've just pulled out a table from Schaler's book, The Deer and the Tiger, in which he reports this 1957 to 58, the estimate of forest cover in India was 24%. And the most recent FSI report says in 2023, it said India's forest cover has increased to 25%. So in this entire huge period, with all the effort trying to chase this target of forest cover, if we have not made a dent, then there is a problem. But this also sort of hides something even more insidious, in the sense, like Divya said, we often have canopy cover, can recover very quickly. And so there are a lot of areas where some green cover has been established through plantations, which are very different from forests. And therefore it hides a form of degradation while appearing to improve tree cover. And Divya has already referred to the scam of compensatory afforestation, but I won't dwell on it too much, is that a lot of the afforestation is being carried out using a handful of species. Large areas are being planted with less than 5 species. Many of those species are non-native. Some of them are actually invasive species. They are being used in Campa programs around the country. And where a large project is coming up to damage an ecosystem. It's being compensated in completely unrelated places. The best example of this, forthcoming example of this, is in Great Nicobar. A unique island ecosystem is said to be devastated for a project. 130, 160 square kilometers of pristine rainforests will be damaged and destroyed in Great Nicobar, and the compensatory afforestation is going to happen in the Aravalis of Haryana. So which makes no sense at all. So, and that's a common problem in many of the green missions as well. So, and we know another important point to consider is that many open natural ecosystems, the grasslands and deserts, are being destroyed through tree planting programs. And if you go by the principles of ecological restoration, this is something that we should work against and we should try and avoid going forward. Although there is also research that shows that many of these large-scale tree planting programs have been utterly wasteful of public money. They have failed completely despite enormous amount of outlay as well. And the new fads that we should caution against, which are, as I already mentioned, about seed balls and Miyawaki forests and large-scale record-setting tree planting and so on. I think many of these are chasing the wrong targets or using inappropriate species or using species we don't know what they are using as well. And there is no evidence supporting the efficacy of these methods. So we should move away from these towards approaches that are more aligned with ecological restoration, because I believe that it can have better effects on ecology and environment. It's more attuned to local conditions, it's better for biodiversity and wildlife, and more likely to succeed as compared to other approaches. And it can also have many benefits for society and economy. And I'll end with a line where, just to reiterate what Divya said, is that this has to happen as a community. And if it has to scale and apply both nationally and internationally, I think groups like this and communities working at the local level can make a huge difference at the wider scale as well. Thank you.